All right, so we've got a pretty fascinating in-depth report here coming from Politico that we're seeing right now about Bernie Sanders' campaign. Now, he has suspended his campaign for president of the United States, and so it's kind of basically over, although he could unsuspend at any point that he wants to. But this piece here is titled, "No One Went for a Knockout Blow. Inside Bernie's Campaign Nosedive." Many of Sanders' aides and top allies are convinced they should have gone for Biden's jugular. Now, this is a decent length report. It's not too long, so we're going to get through everything, and there are a lot of interesting points here, a lot of nuggets of information about various different things that we're going to make sure to take a look at. So let's make sure to go ahead and jump into this. So this here is basically talking about before the South Carolina debate. It says it was late February and Bernie Sanders was days away from the most important debate of his political career. The Vermont senator had finally clawed his way to the top of the presidential primary after winning New Hampshire and crushing the field in Nevada. His closest rival, Joe Biden, was reeling. Moderate Democrats were terrified Sanders could win the nomination, and the target on his back was bigger than ever before. Two of Sanders' top advisors, pollster Ben Tulchin and speechwriter David Sirota, told Sanders that he should pointedly take on Biden at the February 25th debate in South Carolina, which the former vice president saw as his firewall state. They also said Sanders should use billionaire Mike Bloomberg as a foil and attack him over his record of supporting stop-and-frisk in order to deflect from the onslaught he would no doubt face as the newly anointed frontrunner. The stakes were high. In an email to senior staff, Tulchin said that the moderate voters were beginning to unify behind Biden and that the consolidation would intensify if he won South Carolina, according to people familiar with the message. But on the stage that night, Sanders didn't take his aides' advice. Instead, he largely gave Biden a pass, bashed Bloomberg sometimes, but not over stop and frisk, and mostly stuck to his standard talking points. It wasn't the first nor the last time Sanders eschewed his staffers' suggestions to be more aggressive with his top rival. Their warnings proved prescient. Biden went on to sweep the day in South Carolina, unify moderates, and then carry Super Tuesday. So what's interesting about this, obviously anytime there's a debate prior to a state that you're really trying to win, it's crucial to perform well. That's a golden opportunity to really reach out to people. Now, if I remember correctly, and I didn't double check this, I'm just going based off of my memory here, but I believe the South Carolina debate was the one that was a complete disaster. It was just super chaotic. The moderators barely did anything. And it was the one where I do remember Joe Biden going unscathed. Nobody said anything about him. He beefed with Tom Steyer because he was pissed off at Tom Steyer because Tom Steyer was pulling away a significant share of his black vote. That's why he was starting to lose in South Carolina. He was starting to lose ground there. But Joe Biden made some hits on Tom Steyer that seemed to land. In addition to those hits landing, I think Jim Clyburn's endorsement helped Joe Biden a lot there, and Tom Steyer severely underperformed what he was expected to do. And so when you have that opportunity, you have to take that opportunity as a golden opportunity and really use it for what you want. So, for example, in 2016, when we won Michigan, it was like, I think it was at least a debate like the day before Michigan primary, but I think it might have even been like a multiple day thing where it was like multiple days. There was like a town hall one day, then a debate the following day. But there was that debate that had happened. There was that debate, man. And that was crucial. Remember, we were down like 15 points in the polls the day before, but then we came back. A huge part of it was that debate. Okay, and so if Bernie had used this to go to the jugular, not just to the jugular to Biden, but you got to be focused on specific groups. What groups are you going for? You're going for black older voters. Most black voters are older voters. So bring up his Social Security, right? Make sure to bring up, his 1994 crime bill that he wrote. Make sure to bring all of those things up, Social Security again, Medicare, all of this kind of stuff. That's what you want to do, and he did not do that. And so that was definitely a big mistake. Knocking out Joe Biden was job number one, and even when he was down, no one went for a knockout blow, said a top aide. That was the problem. Sanders' unwillingness to go for Biden's jugular is just one of the decisions campaign aides are wrestling with since he exited the primary. Despite being the best fundraiser in the Dem field, having near universal name ID, and leading a massive volunteer army, Sanders performed worse in many ways in 2020 than in 2016. He badly lost among African Americans yet again, and the rural and working class white voters who were with him 4 years ago abandoned him. And so that's what he did. That's what ended up happening. According to interviews with more than 20 of Sanders' aides, surrogates, and top allies, many believe he should have been more aggressive in taking on Biden, including over the idea that he was more electable in November. They also complained about the campaign's organizing strategy and its inability to win over black and senior voters. Though nearly everyone in Sanders' circle felt that the media and political establishments played critical roles in taking him down, they still think the nomination was in his reach. And this is the crucial quote. So, was the whole election against us technically rigged in the fashion that, and in the way that it's like the whole media apparatus which controls the narrative, controls the information that people gets, and it's all owned and controlled by the establishment and the people we're against? Yeah, it is 100%. And we're going to get into some interesting tidbits about this later on, so this will continue. But, as it says here, they still think the nomination was in his reach, and it was. So it was a tough thing to do, but there were a lot of doable things that we could have done. Sadly, we did not get to a place of convincing a large number of people that he was the most quote-unquote electable choice. Faiz Shakir, Sanders' campaign manager, told Politico this week. It turned into a superficial media perception of safe, electable Biden versus revolutionary Bernie Sanders, and I think that dynamic kind of hurt. And so it's a little frustrating that basically, I don't know if this is hindsight or if they knew it at the time, but the fact that they knew it at the time, Faiz Shakir is the campaign chair. He's following Bernie everywhere he goes. You got to do something, man. So if you knew this, as I'm screaming this at the top of my lungs and everyone else is, although I was taking a lot of heat for that, you got to do something. I mean, come on, man. It's difficult to remember now, but Sanders was once seen as unstoppable. After winning Nevada, where he won 50% of Latino voters and finished only 10 points behind Biden among black voters, moderate Democrats panicked that Sanders would roll into Super Tuesday with unrelenting momentum. And since he had shown significant strength among voters of color, they worried he might even take South Carolina. Instead, he lost there by 29 points. Biden had the other guys coalesce around him. Here's another super, super interesting piece. Okay, this is a really important piece. There's some really important tidbits to take away from this. All right, here's one of them. It says, some Sanders aides think he should have used the period between Nevada and South Carolina to appear presidential and broaden his appeal, including to seniors. That was the idea behind a sit-down interview he did with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. Instead, he spent much of his time doubling down on defending positive comments he made in the 1980s about Cuban dictator Fidel Castro's education program. Aides said that weakened his case on the single most important issue to Democratic voters, beating President Donald Trump. Some suggested he strongly condemned the Cuban regime and get off the subject quickly. He didn't take their advice and instead drew out the exchange at the South Carolina debate, arguing that, quote, Cuba, Nicaragua, authoritarianism of any stripe is bad, but that former President Barack Obama had also praised Cuba's educational program. Should we have spent basking in the sun of our Nevada win by talking about Fidel Castro? Not what I would have done, said one aide. Should we have used that time to really open up and become a much bigger tent? Or were we focused on continuing to shore up the progressive vote? So this is a crucial piece. And this is one that doesn't actually get talked about enough. And this is a crucial piece of analysis. So what happened was, and what's supposed to happen when someone wins, there's supposed to be a slew of positive media that results from that, victory. And so when Joe Biden wins, there's 72 hours, 3 days of just nonstop media praise. But when Bernie wins for 7 days, it's just, just saying, James Carville saying Putin's happy and all this other stuff. And Chris Matthews saying, this is like the fall of France. And, it's just crazy stuff. So, the media is obviously at fault, but this was definitely a bad move. The Fidel Castro thing had the potential. I think that potentially tanked the entire campaign. I really believe that. because I think that it turned any potential older voters, because the only people who watch 60 Minutes are older seniors. And so the only people who care about Fidel Castro are people over 60. Nobody under 60 years old cares about Fidel Castro. Nobody thinks about him. No one has, real strong opinions or whatever. They just don't care. Okay, it just isn't the case. What you did was you defended Fidel Castro in front of an audience of literally all old people. That has disaster and catastrophe written all over it. Now, is what Bernie Sanders said wrong? Absolutely not. He's 100,000 million gazillion trillion % correct. All right, he is correct 100%. But was that the right time and place? Now, I know he was asked a question. I'm wondering if that was like an Anderson Cooper. I wonder if CNN nudged him to do it or someone. I'm wondering where the question came from, where the idea of it came from. But he was asked a question, so I think saying that should we have spent the basking in the sun of our Nevada win by talking about Fidel Castro, that's a little bit disingenuous, because it's like, it's as if Bernie brought up Fidel to praise him or something like that. Like, no, he was asked a question, he gave an honest answer, and then boom, it hit him. Bad strategy, though. I don't know what other route he could have taken. This report says that other aides said he should have just condemned the comments. They were from back in the 1980s. That was 40 years ago. So I do think you can kind of shoo away those comments potentially, and just move on and just give a hardcore, just nope, Fidel Castro is bad, authoritarianism is bad, blah, blah, blah. I think that was probably the best route. I don't know what other route there is other than either that or you do what you did. And so it was kind of a trap, and it worked. And I legitimately believe that Fidel Castro thing probably is what tanked his campaign, because you just totally alienated all people over 60. Again, not his fault, because he's right, but people over 60 are idiots, right? So it's tough. But it just, and then the thing is too, it took away from that 7 days that's supposed to be the window of yeah, Bernie's winning, he's presidential, he's gonna win this. The media perception is massive, and so it went from trying to talk about that, even though everyone's saying, oh, he sucks, nobody's even celebrating his win on mainstream media. But it went from that to, oh, let's talk about Fidel Castro, who anybody over 60 hates. And those are all the people who aren't voting for, those are the people who are not voting for Bernie Sanders right now that we need to court to get votes. And so it's just oh, well, that's not very good, is it now? Not very good, is it now? So that really has the potential of seriously tanking his campaign. Single-handedly, honestly. It really could have. Some staffers believe Sanders also should have done more to break through on electability, an issue that was even more important to older and African-American voters, among whom he was weakest. He never conducted focus groups on the issue, or any issue, because of a dislike of such campaign tactics. So I'm definitely not a fan of this either. I mean, you're talking about strategizing. It's not about, typically the focus group problem is when it's it's pandering, it's fake, and then it's fake positions that you hold. If your positions are the same, but you're focus group testing black voters to see, hey, what is it that they care the most about? Healthcare, all this stuff, because I'm better than that guy. My positions are going to stay the same. I just need to figure out what matters to them so I can educate them and give them my pitch, right? Be like, Joe Biden wanted to cut Social Security and Medicare funding. I've defended Social Security and Medicare my whole life. I'm proposing Medicare for all. Joe Biden says no to Medicare for all. I want to upgrade Medicare. Joe Biden doesn't want to do that. And so you figure out which issue. Is it electability? Again, another stupid move by Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders is old. He's stubborn. He's just not he didn't do a good job. A few top advisors felt that Sanders would be seen as more electable once he won early states, and that the matter would take care of itself, while others argued that the campaign should have more directly made the case, and obviously the latter is true. One option they said worked well at the doorsteps was arguing that when Democrats nominated safe establishment choices, such as Clinton and Kerry, they lost, and that Biden was the latest in a long line of mainstream nominees whose appearance as a sure winner was a mirage. But instead, the candidate typically used his go-to lines on the subject that he defeated Trump in nearly every poll, and winning in November would require unprecedented turnout and excitement, which failed to stick. And so that line about the unprecedented turnout definitely didn't stick. It just wasn't a good electability argument in that it just doesn't land. It doesn't stick. I don't know how to describe it. It doesn't really stick. But I think that if you were to spell this out, it might piss some people off. but it would be a great message. And a lot of voters are dumb, especially Democratic voters, like super dumb. Like we're talking like negative IQs. So you kind of have to spell it out for them. You have to like literally like write it out for them, take them word by word so they can understand what you're saying. But yeah, pointing that out would be very, very helpful. It definitely would be, especially because there's just such a massive argument to be had. And it's the thing that I don't understand is that why would you go from nominating one corporate sellout to another, thinking that that's all of a sudden going to make a change? Like, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And so how are you going to think you're going to win? Like, what, second time is the charm? At this point, it's like the 20th time at this point, because Kerry had lost and so many other people had lost too. Al Gore had chose Joe Lieberman as his VP. So, that was I picked that as why he lost. I think he could have won if it wasn't Joe Lieberman. Jane Sanders, the senator's wife and closest advisor, acknowledged that there was more they could have done to persuade people that he was electable as Biden. The facts were on our side. We didn't do it well enough. That is something we should have done better. Now, I'm not a big fan of Jane Sanders, and I know people's wives are advisors and stuff like that, but I think this is more indicative of this situation. I don't like that Jane Sanders is his closest advisor, because basically what Bernie did was he surrounded himself with like 8 people, a tiny, tiny group of people. Super tiny group of people, mostly yes men. They're all noobs. They're not in this political game. They're new to these positions. Faiz Shakir had never been campaign chair before. All right, he let go of all of his other previous guys. He didn't sign with them. So you put in noobs, and then like your family members and all these people are going to refuse to check you, and it's a recipe for disaster. And so a lot of the blame on this campaign deserves to go on Bernie for stuff like this. I mean, how do you do that? You just surround yourself with yes men who are noobs. This is another very interesting tidbit that I did not think about. Bernie Sanders had expected to spend more time in South Carolina, where African Americans cast more than half the vote in Democratic primaries, in the weeks before the primary there. But the senator had to scale those plans back due to the impeachment proceedings, said people familiar with the schedule. Some of Sanders' advisors and allies felt that especially hurt him because he tended to do better with voters who saw him up close. We've got to do better at building relationships with the African American community, said Ro Khanna, Sanders' campaign co-chair of the Progressive Movement. I don't think we have done enough. So this is crucial right here. And so what this tells us is the impeachment proceedings actually hurt Bernie Sanders' campaign a lot. Because if you remember in Iowa, what were the areas that Pete Buttigieg won? He won the rural outside areas, okay? And so Bernie Sanders had bus tours planned, but they had to be scrapped because he had to go back to D.C. to go to the impeachment proceedings. And I remember there were like conspiracies at the time. Remember when Nancy Pelosi had that gap where it was like, oh, we're not going to send in the articles just yet? I don't know, food for thought. Maybe they did that on purpose. I don't know. It would be a genius plan because it worked. Because they couldn't do it. They couldn't do all of the things they wanted to do in Iowa to reach out to the rural areas. And they ended up not being able to do the same thing in South Carolina. So I don't know if they did that on purpose, but if they did, god damn, that's a good plan. Goes on saying Jamal Green, a former Sanders surrogate, said that while the senator brought on a more diverse group of aides than in 2016, and his 2020 team included African-American advisors such as campaign co-chair Nina Turner, National Press Secretary Brianna Joy Gray, Sanders needed additional senior black staffers. The problem was in 2016 and 2020, he had some of the top aides that made the campaign make some wrong decisions. There wasn't enough money put into talking to black older voters who didn't have an opinion on Bernie or didn't like Bernie. And this is absolutely right. And so what they needed to do was they needed to connect with people who are on the ground there. They weren't even really supporting any of the legislators in South Carolina who were supporting Bernie. Like, they wouldn't support him in their race. And so, like, Nina Turner was the person, like, heading the outreach in South Carolina. It's like, how is Nina Turner gonna... She's from Ohio. You know what I mean? Like, you're talking about, like, a southern state where there's, like, a heavy African-American population. She's from Ohio, Northeast. That's not going to work. And also, Nina Turner's not going to reach out to those people. You got to find somebody on the ground who's like knows South Carolina, knows the territory, knows the people there, and understands things like that. Like, you can't, that's how out of touch the campaign was. It's just like, what kind of a strategy is that? Especially when you already did that in 2016. How did that work for you? There's just a lack of like basic reviewing and just basic like looking back and reflection. It just doesn't exist. It's like, how do you do that? And then Breonna Joy Gray, like Breonna Joy Gray is not pulling any black voters to come out, except for maybe some younger black voters. But this is not, if this is what they thought was good outreach for black voters, I don't know what they were thinking, dude. That is a terrible outreach. This is a horrible combination to try to get out, because the vast majority, basically all of black voters are older black voters, because younger black people just don't vote. They just don't vote. So if you're trying to get that out, how is Nina Turner and Breonna Joy Gray going to help you with that? It doesn't make any sense. If that was their plan, that is a terrible plan. This is another interesting tidbit here. It says around the same time that Biden was consolidating moderates behind him, Sanders attempted to bring the progressive wing in the party fully behind him. He talked to Warren over the phone multiple times after she dropped out after Super Tuesday, a top aide said. He asked for her endorsement, as well as for a nod from Andrew Yang and Tom Steyer, the staffer said. Yang said Sanders called the night I suspended, congratulated me, and invited me to meet with him, but did not directly request an endorsement. None threw their weight behind him. He was deeply disappointed that she didn't endorse afterwards, said a person familiar with his talks with Warren. It made him question her progressivism. Now, maybe that was temporary, but I think he was very hurt by that, because he would have endorsed her in a heartbeat if it was the other way around. So, you guys remember Warren, there's a lot of calls on her to drop out, and she did end up dropping out, and we were wondering, okay, who is she going to endorse? Also revealed that Warren and Bernie had some conversations over the phone, and she refused to give her endorsement. Obviously, she's a snake, she's a fraud. You guys know how much I hate Elizabeth Warren. I'm not going to go back into that. I mean, she's just a disgusting human being. But also interesting, reached out to Yang and Tom Steyer. A Tom Steyer endorsement actually would have been pretty helpful for sure. Andrew Yang's endorsement would have been somewhat helpful. Like, it would have been cool for sure. An Andrew Yang endorsement would have nowhere near the effect a Tom Steyer one would, though. But it would still be helpful for sure, especially with the media narrative. But none of them came forward for him. Now, I'm wondering if that's more of a Bernie... I wonder if that's more of a lack of Bernie's skill at sort of courting, because he sucks at that too, which is a key point in politics. And if you can't wine and dine, then you're going to lose. But I don't even know if this is about wine and dining. It's more just about being direct and sort of asking here. But getting those two endorsements would have been crucial, and then plus Warren, that would have been helpful. But obviously, his disappointment with Warren is actually it's a little bit surprising for sure. That relationship may be severed forever. So that whole, friendship is, I guess, just completely dead at this point. Some Sanders staffers said the campaign's polling made a bad situation worse. I guess their polling was wrong, is what they were doing. In total, Sanders' team reported knocking on more doors and calling more voters than any other candidate in the race. Yet he still lost to Biden, who didn't even campaign in some states where he coasted to victory. And then it just talks about some other stuff about, campaign outreach not being very good. Here it says, Buttigieg's ultimate victory in rural parts of the state helped him run up the delegate score and win Iowa. Claire Sandberg, Sanders' national organizing director, felt that campaign leadership should have hired more field staff earlier in 2019 across states, including Iowa, according to a person familiar with their thinking. Others said that Sanders should have visited more rural areas there. A planned campaign swing in rural Iowa was scrapped because of impeachment. Again, impeachment really hurt the campaign big time. I did not expect that to happen. That's very unfortunate. Again, I remember Nancy Pelosi holding on to those articles, dude. I do remember that. So, did they have that planned? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know. So it goes on to say many in the campaign partly blame cable TV for that. This is interesting as well. With the media tracking service Critical mention estimating Biden enjoyed nearly $72 million in almost completely positive earned media in the days between SC and Super Tuesday. But some of Sanders' aides and allies also think they could have done a better job at handling the press. So the thing is, you can't combat $72 million in positive earned media. It's impossible. You can't even, there's no way to raise or spend that much money in 3 days. It's virtually impossible. And so that's impossible to combat. But It says they think the campaign should have had more surrogates on MSNBC and other cable news channels. Staffers were also told at times not to pitch opposition research on rivals, a standard job for the communications shop on most campaigns, due to the fact that Sanders disliked negative campaigning. And Sanders sometimes rebuffed the press. According to an MSNBC spokesperson, the network had a long-standing invitation for Sanders to participate in the town hall, but he declined. Now, another thing I don't like, and this is a problem and critique that I've had on Bernie ever since 2016. I remember, although he went harder on Hillary last time than he did this time on Joe, I still felt like he had kid gloves. You remember, oh, we're tired of hearing about your damn emails, instead of really going for the jugular. The fact that he was not doing, pitching opposition research on rivals, I think is just a really bad idea. And because of your dislike of negative campaigning, I mean, you lost. What does that say about negative campaigning, Some of Sanders' allies felt he should have brought on longtime professionals who knew and could better deal with the mainstream media. He needed to hire somebody who could talk to the corporate media and could call in favors, says Surrogate. Sanders' team zeroed in on the liberal network MSNBC early on in the campaign as a particular problem, even more than CNN or Fox News. His aides felt that its pundits were extremely negative and unfair towards Sanders. Over the summer, Sanders and his top brass sat down with network president Phil Griffin in what MSNBC described as an off-the-record editorial board meeting. It's really interesting. I thought we walked out of there without a good common understanding, said Shakir. My big point to them was this is Bernie Sanders, the human being. This is not the angry, yelling, finger up in the air Bernie Sanders as you guys often portray. Here he is, the human being. Talk to him. But any optimism was short-lived. It just didn't feel like it ever fundamentally changed, said Shakir. We tried that approach. Didn't change. And then says a guy named Mike Casca came on, who is a respective figure among the press corps that covered Bernie. But again, I'm going to repeat this because I told you guys this in my other readings of the previous reports about the inside of the Bernie campaign. This says, in August, Sanders' campaign also talked with his former TV ad firm, Divine Mulvey Longabaugh, about returning. In addition to being behind the famous 2016 spot, America, the business had served as a link between the Sanders movement and more mainstream Democrats in the press. But an aide said Sanders balked at what he saw as too steep a price, leading him to believe that the firm was more concerned with money than the cause. And so I firmly believe, had we gotten up back with Mark Longabaugh, who's a partner of this business, he was a campaign senior advisor in 2016. He did a great job with advertisements and all of that stuff. And he knew what the strategy should have been. And he told Bernie that, I said, make inroads at the CBC, you got 42%. Now you just got to make a little bit more of inroads with black voters. So he knew what to do. My man Mark knew what to do. He knew what to do. But they didn't go with him because the price was too steep. Bro, who cares about the price? Pay him, whatever. I don't care. Especially when you had so much money to burn, dude. That campaign had so much cash. It had a lot of cash. So there's not really any excuse there. And who cares if it's about the cause, dude? They're there to make a profit. They're not there to be your, the progressive movement. We're the progressive. We just need the experts' help. They're the experts. They're the one who are the strategists. You can't do this alone, Bernie. You are not Thanos. You are not God. You don't know what you're doing. So you have to hire experts to help you. That's why experts exist. Yes, that's why they exist, okay? So you can get them to give you advice. You don't just hire randos and newbies and then go with them and then you lose. And like, whoa, what happened? You didn't take any of the experts, dude. You dipped on them. And this angers me to no end. This is why I think the campaign was DOA. It just completely dead on arrival. Because it's like, how are you going to let go of your brass from 2016 who knew what to do? And I want to do an interview with Mark Longabaugh. I'm trying to figure out how to get in contact with the guy. But he says, it was Bernie's campaign that reached back out to us, said Mark Longabaugh, a partner at the business. We put a pretty standard contract on the table. It was not out of bounds in any way. It was, in fact, a smaller commission than we actually received in 2016. So either way, this is what he's saying. So, I mean, that's a defense in him. But either way, I don't care what the price was. Spend the money. I don't care. You had plenty of cash. This is about winning, baby. I don't care what the price tag is, okay? Seriously, you had plenty of cash to burn. There's no excuse there. Despite the campaign's attempts to deal with MSNBC, the network's hosts and pundits blasted Sanders the day he won the Nevada caucus. The type of campaign development might have resulted in other candidates winning a slew of positive media. Chris Matthews compared Sanders' victory to the fall of France. James Carville said a Sanders nomination would be a political ending, and that Russia President Vladimir Putin was, quote, the happiest person right now about the news. The media between Nevada and Super Tuesday was more negative than anybody could have ever anticipated, said Jane Sanders. That's something I hope the media would look at. Then, this is also interesting. Shakir contacted Griffin after the show and demanded an apology for Matthews' remarks, which Sanders was deeply offended by as a Jewish man. Matthews admitted on air it was a mistake and later parted ways with MSNBC on the eve of Super Tuesday. Bro, I'm starting to think that we sacrificed Bernie's campaign to get rid of Chris Matthews, because it's weird. Right when Chris Matthews dipped, the campaign was over. He's gone the eve of Super Tuesday, but he was really gone like a week before that kind of thing. But he was gone eve of Super Tuesday, and then boom, we lose on Super Tuesday. The campaign's over. Coincidence? I think not. We sacrificed a Bernie Sanders victory just to get rid of Chris Matthews. Not worth it in my book. Not worth it. But this is where I talk about it. This is what I mean by, like, it's not really fair and the election is rigged against us. And for all the talk of state TV and all this stuff, when you think about the shows, you know, what progressive shows do you really have? Chris Hayes, who's not even really all that big on being pro-Bernie or that vocal about it. Everybody else, Joyanne Reid, Chris Matthews. Shout out to Joe Scarborough, actually. He was good to Bernie. Big respects to Joe Scarborough. So shout out to my boy Scarborough for doing that. He has my respects for sure. But every other show just hates on Bernie Sanders nonstop. Zerlina Maxwell, Joyanne Reid, all of these people, Chris Matthews, they just hate on him, bro. Shout out to Steve Kornacki too, although he's a numbers guy, so he's just going off the numbers. But all of these shows, their editorial pieces are just hating on him. And so when you're supposed to have like this sort of praise that Joe Biden gets, it's not fair, you know? They control the narrative and the media and the information, and you can only be on there if you agree with what they say. MSNBC is not going to hire a Kyle Kulinski. They would never do that. You know what I mean? So that's a problem. You know what I'm saying? That's a problem, dude. And so that's a tough barrier to overcome. But I still believe this is winnable. Because as this article itself lays out, the Bernie campaign could have done more to deal with the press. They could have hired Mike Longabaugh to have better connections and understanding of what to do. They could have done all of this stuff. But you can't compete with $72 million of free advertising within 3 days. It's just simply impossible. But this was definitely within reach. A lot of important pieces, but in conclusion, impeachment hurt us because we were not able to go into, Bernie wasn't able to go into early states in areas like rural areas in Iowa, wasn't able to go to other areas in South Carolina. So that definitely hurt him. His handling of the press was not a good job. He parted ways with Mark Longabaugh there, obviously. And so, you know, those are sort of the piece take from this. The Elizabeth Warren endorsement attempt also is another big thing to take. Fidel Castro was a big hit on the campaign for sure. A massive, massive hit. And so those are the things, man. We got a lot to take away from it. I encourage you to be hypercritical of Bernie Sanders in the campaign because we got to move forward from this. We got to reflect. And we got to gear up for the next time. So there's still a lot of elections to be had, especially down ballot races. So I'm looking forward to more House candidates winning. So please focus on House candidates. But really amazing report here. Very interesting stuff coming out of this report. But yeah, very interesting stuff.